Hey, welcome to Leadership Within, the moment for leaders to reflect on their human experience of leadership. I'm your host TK, and I'm joined by
Vanessa.
Hey Vanessa, lovely to have you again. It's great that we're recording another episode. Well, at least the heat wave is a bit further away, so we have a spot to sit with the microphone and talk to our wonderful listeners.
Yeah, it's refreshing, isn't it, to have a little bit of air?
It is true, and I hope that our wonderful listeners, when you're listening to this, you're in good spirits and good thermal comfort. So with that in mind, we're going to talk about something that I found is maybe not equally difficult, but for many, quite a challenge. You see, we've talked about similar things on this podcast before, but the people I've been working with recently and throughout my career have had a bit of a difficulty because I usually work with leaders at the start of their journey. First-time managers, aspiring leaders, aspiring managers, you name it. And quite often, when they get a promotion, there's this moment of having an imposter syndrome and being really scared to ask for help, even if they need it. So I want to talk today about why it feels so hard and what tips do we have for, starting leaders or leaders at the start of their journey to actually, well, maybe ask despite fear. I'm wondering, Vanessa, if you've seen the same as I have in terms of leaders, especially at the start of their journey, resenting or finding it difficult to ask for help.
Yeah, I definitely have had that. I think it's a really common experience. I certainly experience it a lot with women, because I think the perception is that we have to hold it all together and be strong and independent. And I think there's this association that sometimes if we ask for help, that it means something about us. So it means like I couldn't figure it out on my own, or I was weak, or something. So I think there's a natural resistance to asking for help sometimes, with the constructs that we have around who we need to be.
It is interesting. If you don't mind, would be willing to lean into it because one would assume, or at least I have assumed, that it would be harder for men because, maybe the social expectation is that, men should hold it together and be brave. And yet, the experience that you're quoting, and, I can definitely see that with a lot of wonderful women I work with, seems to be that both genders, anyone you are, there's always this feeling like the world is on your shoulders. It's
Yeah.
maybe a universal experience, isn't it?
Yeah. So I think it's really, if I think back to the time when I was either job sharing or working less hours part time because my kids were younger, there's this element of I need to prove myself worthy. And therefore, what you often see is this tendency to try and do full time work in part time
Mm-hmm.
hours. And so, if you were to then say, do you know what, I haven't got capacity for that, that might mean something. I mean, times have moved on since I was doing it, but I still think it's really relevant today. I see a lot of women with burnout, and or on the edge of it, because they have a tendency to put it all on them. And then there's the other piece to it as well, which is sometimes we like to be in control. So it's easier for me to just keep doing than necessarily ask for help and assistance with things.
That's quite true. Obviously, maternity is a unique experience for women, and I can definitely understand how this is a thing that would cause people to, or wonderful women to feel like it's they need to prove themselves, they need to do more, right? Because it's demanded of them. On the other hand, you've got possibly younger men feeling like they need to progress in the pack of wolves. They need to stay late because, that's what they're for. And it's interesting that we develop all these kinds of mental models, and they
Yes.
usually aren't. What's surprising is I often tend to think that people are a bit more cynical. That it's a thing that we tend to find ourselves optimizing. Maybe many people assume in the theory X, theory Y that people, would be willing to slack off a bit. And yet, the what we have found, and I think we're sharing this experience, is people put so much pressure on themselves. It's actually the opposite. People want to work more. People are driven, especially when they've changed the role, to do more than they maybe should. And it's an interesting model how we behave this way. Something drives us there.
Yeah, and so when you said about imposter syndrome, I think, in my perspective on that is it's actually really similar. We're probably describing similar things, which is, wow, I've been given this role, and I need to prove that I'm worth it. And there's a part of me that's kind of like, oh, am I really good enough for this? Like,
Mm-hmm.
and so I think sometimes we load expectations on ourselves, and then we isolate ourselves in terms of like, well, I've got to look a certain way. I've got to look like I've got my shit together, because otherwise they might be questioning, why did that person get why did I get the role? So for me, I think this kind of, I think there are a number of elements. I think this is one element to it, is that, there's this like a kind of hustle for, am
Mm-hmm.
I worthy of this? That can show up in different ways. So I think that's one element. But I also kind of think, and this is weird because it came up in supervision for me this
Okay.
week, which my supervisor was saying, she was talking about ask cultures versus guess
Ooh,
cultures,
okay.
right? So an ask culture is somewhere where we can ask directly. So if you think about my family of origin, um, we are not askers. We don't directly
Mm.
ask for things. We do a lot more guesswork, like drop subtle hints. So I really appreciate when someone is very direct with me and they say what I'd like, or I need this, and then they're okay with, no, actually I can't do that, or yes, I can do that. But I think this idea that in some of the places that we work, the prevalent culture can be one of, a guest culture, a kind of more passive culture. Um, I think it doesn't necessarily always support the behavior of being very direct and asking. So, making clear requests. Sometimes what we find in cultures is that actually what we do is we complain about the things that aren't working, or we drop hints about, oh, I'm so busy.
Mm.
And we hope someone's going to step in, but they don't actually. Maybe that's part of the British psyche. But I like this idea of like, okay, am I in a culture in my team, with my manager, with my director, whoever, where it's okay for us to ask and say yes or no?
All right. There's loads to unpack. There's so many things I want to pick up on as you said it. But I'll maybe go with something that pulls me the strongest because, I could talk about how we're anthropologically geared towards safety, and this is why we always see the danger, and this is where the
Yeah,
imposter syndrome comes from. We could talk about the fact that when I was young, I just didn't see, or inexperienced, let's call it, managers asking for help, right? So I had no role models. Um, as you say, even in my family of origin, I never seen my father or my mother saying, well, I actually don't know. Let me ask my friend, mentor, someone, right? So I maybe
right.
never developed this habit. But the interesting thing I would say is, well, being maybe a bit subversive and taking a role of a devil's advocate, because what resonates with me is the fact that I've worked with a person that has definitely enabled a lot of the ask culture, which is they always were asking a question instead of making a statement. Even though I thought they were clearly empowered and, we were theoretically equals in this relationship to make decisions on their own, especially like, on some very tactical level. They did not require a consultation of any sort. It's like, look, right, just do it. And yet they constantly asked me questions. And it started to really annoy me. I felt like, oh, please, right? You don't need to ask permission. You don't need to ask me about anything. Just tell me what you
AFGI.
want, right? Well, that's one thing, right? That's absolutely one thing. But on the other hand, just make a statement and tell me what you want,
Yeah.
right? I can
Yeah.
say I don't like it. I can say I disagree. I probably will do my best to accommodate because, well, I'd like to be kind and I would like you to feel included. But constant asking, I guess it's another end of the spectrum, can really annoy people. So I guess, rattling through these things as I did, reflecting on what you said, it's a complex one. So how does one find balance when there's so little to go on in terms of examples and role models?
Yeah. And I think in the example you give, it's a different kind of ask. So what I'm hearing, and I may not be hearing it correctly, is that the ask in that situation is almost permission seeking. Like,
Yes.
whereas I think um, in in the context that we started, it was more around how do I ask for help? How do I ask, as a leader, how do I make the ask? So I think sometimes it's like, what's the reason that I'm asking for this? Am I asking for permission? And I was just thinking of, I've got a
Mm.
colleague who is very direct in her asks, and I really like the directness of her. And I noticed that after about 5 asks, I was feeling pissed off, right? But obviously, not really showing that. And when I sat with why am I pissed off, it's like because I've asked you for nothing, and you keep asking me. And then it's like, so why am I not asked? Why am I not making an ask, right? And I think, for me, definitely, I have resistance around asking for help, um, and that definitely comes from worrying about what others might think about why I'm asking for help. Do you know what I mean? Like, what's the story they're making up? So I might hold and this is really deep rooted for me because when you were talking about families and stuff, I remember being sat in the classroom, not
Mhm.
knowing and not understanding, putting my hand up and then being embarrassed or ridiculed, because it's like, duh. So I've got resistance that's really ingrained about if I ask for help, it might mean that they think I'm dumb, I'm stupid, I don't get it. And everybody else does. Right? And in the work context, so often I find with the work that we do, you always, you're kind of dying for someone to raise their hand and
Yeah.
say the thing. And yet there's this, often there's this silence that's really different, like that, it's just painful to sit in this place where something wants to happen and, something's not working and no one's lifting their hand. And so for me, I have to give myself a lot of permission to go, it's okay to not know, or it's okay to not understand, or, it's okay to be authentic with where you are. Um, and sometimes I do it brilliantly, and sometimes I default to the old habit. So for me, I think there's something about how do we as leaders ask for help with a clear ask, be okay that it might be a yes or a no back or whatever. And even if we are asking for help in those contexts where actually we're just trying to cover our ass, which is, I think, the context you gave, like
Hmm.
just ask, 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 ask.
Or getting the validation, right? Just
Yeah.
getting, yeah.
How do we then have the conversation that says, wow, I'm noticing, and my sense is you're needing some kind of permission. What is that? Um, and how would you give that to yourself rather than looking at it from me? So yeah, I think it's so interesting, isn't it? All of this, um, yeah, all of this
It
to me
is.
comes down to, okay, what's your history with asking? You know?
Yeah. And, as again, so much to unpack. So a couple of shares from me. I actually remember, a story came to me, which is years and years ago. Um, I was working, not naming a multinational company as an employee, and a new senior leader came along. I worked in a satellite office. He came to us because he was going to present to a client. Um, it's like the first week of his work. Pulled out a deck, and there was obviously some newness to it. And I remember it was me and one of my other colleagues were roughly on the same level, me and him. And the director was like going through the deck, and there was something, I think, about the organization, also quite technical, he didn't get. And he has asked us for our opinion, basically saying he doesn't know. And I was absolutely shocked. It was like the first time in my life that a senior leader said he doesn't know something to me. And you know what? Even though I had to take some time to collect my, that's not that it was really emotional, but I didn't know how to react. I had the information, but I remember I started stammering. It was like, oh my God, what's happening here, right? It was just so strange. And, I really value this person still. We're still in touch. And I often remind him about this particular situation, how, how he did that. And unfortunately, how I did not have the examples of people doing this, right? When I was,
Yeah.
I was
Yeah.
becoming a leader, this one really made a difference for me. But on the other hand, there's something that I wanted to share, going to maybe the next half of our episode, which is how to deal with that. Well, you've shared a great example about what I think Carnegie calls the scorecard in the sky, which is, someone asking you, right? And at one point, the scorecard becomes quite unbalanced.
Yes.
The currency of, favors becomes standard, and it's difficult. Then, the resentment happens and so on. So I'm dealing with that quite a bit myself, asking people for help. I think in 2025, I've asked quite a few people to give me advice, ask them for help in terms of market research and so on. And there were so many brilliant people that have actually offered me their hand. But the way I try to do that is, even though the scorecard will be slanted, because I'm often asking them without prior offering anything, I'm trying to balance it with the universe. So, to our listeners, you might find it helpful. See, I help people theoretically for karma quite often. Quite often, people come to me for mentoring, come to me for advice, and I very often do my utmost best to assist, to help, going above and beyond, always being available, always giving as much value as I can, theoretically from the goodness of my heart, but practically it also is the fact that, look, right, I'm a good person, I'm giving, so I'm entitled to ask for something from someone else. And it's really liberating to think like that, at least for me. So maybe our listeners can take a hint about one of the ways you can deal with, enabling yourself to ask for help. What do you think, Vanessa? What is it that helps you or your clients?
Yeah. Gosh, I really need to think about that. What helps? So the question is, what helps me to ask for help?
Or what do you see being effective for people you work with, right? In terms of like asking for help when you are in a position of perceived authority as a leader.
Yeah, I think sometimes it's that, okay, so if we flip it, what's the
Mm.
impact of not asking for help?
Mhm.
So maybe kind of thinking, how long is this sustainable for, with you holding up everything, and taking it all on? And I think sometimes that makes people kind of realize, like, oh wow, if one extra thing comes onto my plate, then it's all going to fall out. It's all going to
Mm.
break. So I think sometimes, just saying, okay, well, if you continue along this trajectory, what's the likely impact for you, your health, your well-being, your performance, all those things. Um, and I think that's helpful sometimes. So that's one. Um, and I think I'm trying. Yeah. So sometimes I've worked with. I often have worked with people in the NHS.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, of
And
course.
so there's this kind of caring,
Yeah.
service mentality. And I think helping them see that what they give, um, like, people genuinely want to help. So sometimes I think we see it as if, oh, I'm here to help. And then we assume it's a burden for others, but actually most people like to be asked. So
Yeah.
giving people homework around, okay, how, make 5 asks in a day or whatever it is, right? And see, it doesn't matter if it's just, can you just open the door for me? I'm juggling things or whatever, but just see what the response is. And I actually think it's quite surprising when you start to track evidence of when you ask someone for something, often what you'll find is actually they're quite enthusiastic and excited about the fact that you've included them.
There you go, right? Yeah, just my
Yeah,
examples. Yeah.
exactly. Right. So I think then that helps kind of dissipate the story around it means something about me that I'm weak or I'm not, not enough. Actually, it's like, well, actually asking for help is an inclusive behavior. It's a team behavior, and it takes us away from the I to the collective, the we. So that's something I would suggest for people to start to play with.
Wow, that's quite brilliant, right? Just maybe really shifting it in your mind, just to say, well, asking for help is actually a show of inclusion. Because
Yeah,
maybe, to be honest, if you are in a position of authority, maybe your director, your leader also wants to be included in what you do, right? Maybe, every leader, as you know yourself, and if you're our listener, well, you probably are either a leader or an aspiring leader, sometimes feels alone and sometimes wants to build a connection with you. Often they should. And asking for help is also enabling them to do that. And I think that's a wonderful thing. And this making this shift can be really beneficial.
yeah, and I think it also speaks to the point that you made, which is when your leader asked for help, you felt almost like a relief that wow, this is a really authentic person, and I've not
Mm.
experienced much of that. So it's like, okay, who do you want to be as a leader? Do you want to be the leader that is guarded, protected, coming across as having all their shit together and needing no one? Or do you want to be the leader that is authentic, real, human, and encouraging that human interaction? I know which one I'd prefer to be.
Well, that's quite true, right? But on the other hand, or going forward with this, it's also important to show, not just tell. Because I, at one point, had a leader that has done something unproductive, which is they said, well, I'll be adding things for you. I'll be sending them your way, chucking, more onto your wagon, and just tell me when you've got enough, when you're overloaded.
Yeah.
And, I can imagine you and our listeners know what happened in this situation. It was really unproductive. And it just shows that because I was not close to this particular leader geographically or, maybe even relationship wise, which is a shame because I think they could have helped me a lot. And they did actually. And, they've got themselves to give me some good feedback, which actually changed the way I lead. I just think saying things like that, even though is reasonable, and definitely this is a good example of how delegation can be pushed too far with some people. I think it just needs examples, right? You probably want to follow up with it with an example that I'm also doing it. I'm not just saying it to you. This is an accepted behavior in this team, in this company, in this organization, this culture, that we do that. We ask for help. So that's important to
Yeah.
show examples, right?
And I think in listening to you, what it brings up for me is when you ask for help as a leader, you are bringing a certain amount of rank with you
Mm.
and authority. And in my experience, it is usual for people who are working for a leader to want to please or to want to deliver on things. So there is something, I think there's a responsibility in an ask that there is the option to say no. There is, and that
Hmm.
people feel that that is available to them. So rather than implicitly assuming, because what in your example, I felt like that was dumping rather than
Yeah.
necessarily. Do you know what I mean? Like we can just keep delegating and delegating until someone says no. And I think that assumes that people feel okay to say no. So for me, there's something around how do you ensure that the relationship is there that enables the person to level up, equalize in power or status, and say, my capacity is X. If you want me to do this, then can you help me take something else off my plate? So I think there's something about that in the ask about really making sure that someone is resourced and able to say, to take it as an ask rather than a demand.
It's a very good point, right? And opens up another conversation. That being said, we're trying something new, our dear listeners, which is slightly shorter episodes that we focus on one thing. And in this case, we hope that we gave you a lot of tips on how to ask for help as a leader, showed you that we have done so throughout our careers. And it's a good thing to do. So you might want to do that yourself and enable your leaders to do that. And any closing remarks, Vanessa, before I wrap up the episode?
No, I would just encourage you to practice with the asks. Like it's you might be surprised what comes back.
You might be surprised. And our dear listeners, in this new format, we're also more than open to your feedback. So if you have anything that you'd like us to talk about, any changes in our conversation that you feel would help you, get more fun learning and just joy from listening to us, drop us a line. You can reply to the podcast email. And as always, we're looking forward to hosting you again in 2 weeks, and so you're a part of our conversation again. Have a nice one.